Sign it. A penniless nobody like you will never touch my empire.
Stop. She owns $3 trillion.
Divorce papers signed in silence. Sign the papers, Evelyn. You were a mistake my son made before he understood what this family requires. For 5 years, Evelyn quietly built a life inside one of Manhattan's most powerful families, asking for nothing more than to be loved for who she was rather than what she came from. She hid her name, her inheritance, and her past, not out of deception, but out of a hope that if she started with nothing, what grew between them would be real. She was 6 months pregnant when her mother-in-law placed divorce papers in front of her. She picked up the pen without a word, but the silence Evelyn kept, for all those years, was about to become the most expensive thing the Reeve family ever underestimated. Chapter 1. She signed without a sound. Evelyn had spent the better part of a week rehearsing her silence, not what she would say, not how she would argue or cry or make him feel the weight of what he was doing. Just the silence, the clean, unbreachable kind that cannot be mistaken for weakness by people who have built their lives around looking for it. She had it ready when the car pulled up to the Reeve estate on a Tuesday morning in November, the kind of gray New York morning that offers nothing and does not apologize for it. She had it ready when she walked through the front door that the housekeeper held open with the look of a woman who was sorry but had been told not to show it. And she had it ready when she pushed open the library door and the room arranged itself in front of her exactly the way she had imagined it would. Margaret Reeve stood at the head of the long mahogany table. She was 63 years old and had the posture of someone who had decided very early on that bearing was its own form of authority and had never once let it slip. Pearl earrings, a charcoal blazer, silver hair she had allowed to come in naturally at 50 because she knew it suited her, and she was right. Everything about Margaret was calibrated, not elegant, not imposing, calibrated. That was the word Evelyn had always come back to, the one that fit without slipping. 2 lawyers sat on one side of the table with the carefully neutral expressions of people being paid to be furniture. Julian was at the window. He was not looking at Evelyn when she came in. He was facing the garden, or at least the direction of it, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders holding the tension of a man who has made a decision and is now waiting for its consequences to finish arriving. He was 38 years old, and still the kind of man who changed the temperature of a room when he entered it. Evelyn noted this without feeling anything much about it, the way you note a fact about someone you used to know well. She was wearing a white dress, simple, structured, cut to accommodate the 6 months of pregnancy she was carrying without hiding it. She had chosen it deliberately. She wanted to be seen exactly as she was. She sat down across from the lawyers. She opened the folder in front of her. This was what nobody in the room had prepared for. Not the lawyers who were used to clients scanning divorce documents with the glassy distress of people who cannot quite make themselves believe the language applies to them. Not Margaret, who had managed enough legal proceedings to know how they moved and had expected this one to feel like something she was overseeing. And not Julian, who had turned from the window when she sat down and was watching her now with an expression she did not try to read. She read every page. She took her time with the financial disclosures. She stopped at the clause about the child, the one using the phrase biological issue of the marriage, and read it twice. She had understood it the first time. She read it again because she wanted no ambiguity in her own mind about what she was agreeing to. Then she moved on. It took 11 minutes. She knew because the Vienna clock on the library shelf, the one Julian's father had brought back from a business trip 20 years ago, was directly in her line of sight the whole time. When she reached the final page, she picked up the pen. Sign the papers, Evelyn. Margaret's voice was not unkind. That was the thing about her. She was never unkind in a way you could point to later and say, that was the moment, that was the line. The cruelty lived inside the framing of things, in the assumptions built into every sentence, in the way she controlled a room so completely that you were always responding on her terms, and never your own. You were a mistake my son made before he understood what this family requires. Evelyn looked at the pen in her hand. She signed. She closed the folder. She set the pen down parallel to its edge with the precision of someone who is finished. Then she stood. "Thank you," she said, in the direction of the lawyers, a courtesy. They had done their jobs. She picked up her coat, put it on, buttoned it, and smoothed the front with both hands. She did not look at Julian. She had made that decision the night before, and she kept it, not because she was afraid of what she would feel, but because she had already felt it. Months ago, in a bathroom with the door locked and the faucet running. She was on the other side of that now. At the door she paused. Mrs. Reeve. Margaret turned. "The Price Bridge loan has a clause in Section 14 that your team missed. When the engagement announcement goes public, it activates." She let a beat pass. "You might want someone to look at it before Friday." Then she walked out. The housekeeper was in the hall with the look of a woman who wanted to say something and had decided against it. Evelyn gave her a small nod. She was not angry at anyone in this house except the person she had just left in the library, and even that had stopped being anger a long time ago. It was more like the feeling of having carried something heavy for too long and finally setting it down. Not relief, something quieter than relief. She stepped outside. The November air was cold and direct. She walked to the car, and Thomas, the driver she had hired through a private service for exactly this kind of morning, got out when he saw her and opened the door without being told. Before she got in, she looked at her watch. It was an old one. The leather strap had worn down to a dark, butter-soft color at the edges after years of daily use. The face was clean and cream-colored, with small Roman numerals and a mark at the top that read WCP in letters fine enough that you would need to already know what they meant to make them out. Julian had asked about it once, early in their marriage. She had told him her grandfather gave it to her, which was true, and changed the subject, which she had always been good at. She touched the face of it briefly, then she got in. Before Thomas pulled out of the driveway, her phone lit up. An unknown number. It had been trying to reach her since early that morning. She typed back one word, "Not yet." She put the phone away and watched the Reeve gates disappear as the car turned onto the road. She let herself think about what was behind her for exactly the time it took to clear the neighborhood. Then she stopped. She had known, going in, who Julian Reeve was. She knew who his mother was. She had walked into the marriage not with her eyes closed, but with an open and deliberate hope, which is a different thing from naivety and costs just as much when it fails. The hope had been this: if she arrived as Evelyn Cross, a woman with a career she had built herself and a life with no famous name attached to it, she would know with certainty whether what grew between them was real. She had built that life since she was 22 years old, the year she packed one bag and took a train out of her grandfather's house in Connecticut and called Cassius from the station to tell him she needed to find out who she was before he decided it for her. He had been furious, then resigned, then, in the years that followed, quietly proud in a way he would never have admitted to her directly. She had built a career in financial analysis. She had her own apartment, her own clients, her own friends, who knew her as someone they had chosen rather than someone who came attached to a name. She had been careful. She had been good at it. Then she sat at a conference table next to a man she had never met, and he argued her own position more effectively than she had, and then turned around and apologized for it with a self-awareness that genuinely surprised her. She had loved Julian Reeve the way you love someone who seems at first to see you clearly. The problem was that what he saw clearly was Evelyn Cross. He had never been invited to see the rest of it. She had told herself the rest of it did not matter yet, and then told herself again and again until the time for telling him had passed, and the omission had hardened into something she could no longer name easily. It was not a clean story. She understood that. She took out her phone and called back the number. It rang once. Ms. Whitlock. Graham Ellery had been with Whitlock Credit Partners for 22 years. He had the unhurried voice of someone who handles large amounts of other people's money and has made a personal policy of never being unsettled by any of it. "The papers are signed," she said. "The meeting is confirmed for Thursday. Your grandfather will be relieved." The warmth in those 3 words told her Cassius had been more anxious about this morning than he had let on. Send the preliminary letter to the Reeve Group's credit desk today. Standard language. Periodic review of facility terms. Nothing that reads as unusual. 30-day timeline? Yes. She ended the call and looked out the window at the city moving past in the gray morning. Thomas pulled up in front of her building on the Upper West Side. Pre-war, quiet block, good bones, and nothing to prove. She had rented it 6 weeks ago, after the conversation with Julian. It was 40 floors below what the Whitlock name could have arranged. That was the point. She was done with ceilings being the measure of things. She rode the elevator up and let herself in. The apartment was mid-arrangement, the way a place looks when someone is still deciding how permanent it should feel. Boxes in the second bedroom. She had been calling it the second bedroom. That was going to need to change. She set her coat on the hook by the door and stood in the kitchen for a moment without doing anything. Then she put both hands flat on the counter and let herself feel the full weight of the morning. Not the grief. That was done. The weight of what she was carrying forward, which she had chosen deliberately and intended to keep choosing. She lifted one hand and placed it on her stomach. 6 months. A person who was listening to all of this and was going to inherit whatever came next. "Okay," she said quietly. Just that. That evening, on the 44th floor of the Reeve Group building, Julian sat at his desk and worked through his inbox with the focused attention of a man who is trying very hard to stay inside the work. He had been at it for 3 hours. He had signed things, rejected things, approved a budget that mattered, and rescheduled something that no longer did. He had done all of it with the efficiency of someone who has built his identity around being useful under pressure, and he had almost managed to stop seeing the library every time he looked at something white. Almost. The thing about Evelyn, the thing he had never fully settled in his own mind, was that she was always the calmest person in any room during a crisis. She was always the only one who had read the complete document. He had thought, in the first years of their marriage, that this was something he loved about her. Later, as his mother's version of Evelyn slowly replaced his own, he had let himself reclassify it as something closer to coldness. He had told himself that reading made sense. He had stood at the window this morning because he could not watch her read. The next email in his queue was a forward from the financial systems team. Subject: Notice of Periodic Review, Whitlock Credit Partners. 3 short paragraphs. Standard language, 30-day timeline. Routine assessment of facility terms. His CFO had added a single line at the top. Scheduling a call with their rep team next week. Should be standard. Julian read it once. Then he read it again. Whitlock Credit Partners. He had seen that name recently, and his mind reached for the context and came back without it. He forwarded the email to his assistant with a note to pull the original facility documents and moved on. 7 other things still needed his attention tonight, and this was not one of them. He closed his laptop at 9:30. On his way out, he passed the framed photograph in the hallway outside his office. It had been there 4 years. Him and Evelyn at a charity event in the second year of their marriage, when they were still the version of a couple that looked right in photographs. She was in green. She was laughing at something he had said. The brown leather watch was on her wrist. He stood in front of that photograph longer than he intended. He told himself the Whitlock thing was routine. He was wrong about that, but it would take him a while to understand how completely. Chapter 2. The alliance built on her empty chair. The announcement ran on a Thursday, which Margaret had chosen deliberately. Thursday was the day the society pages went to print for the weekend editions, and Margaret had been managing her family's public appearances long enough to know exactly which morning a story needed to land if you wanted it to shape the conversation rather than respond to it. By noon, the engagement of Julian Reeve, CEO of the Reeve Group, to Annabelle Price, daughter of Stanford Price of Price Capital, had been confirmed by 3 separate outlets. The photographs, taken at the Alderton Club the previous evening, showed Julian in a dark suit and Annabelle in ivory, composed and carefully lit, her hand resting near his on the table in a way that looked natural and had been thought about. Evelyn Cross Reeve did not appear in any of them. She had, as of that morning, been quietly removed from the Alderton Club's membership rolls. Her name had been taken off the December guest list for the Harmon Foundation Gala. A mutual acquaintance called to say she was sorry, in a tone that made clear she had also heard something vague and regrettable about the reasons for the divorce. The call lasted 4 minutes. Evelyn thanked her and hung up. She knew exactly what was happening. Margaret did not operate through scenes or confrontations or anything as direct as a threat. She worked by rearranging the architecture around a person. A quiet word here, a name removed from a list there, a story released into the right ear at the right dinner. Within a week, the social landscape of a woman's life could be restructured so thoroughly that, by the time anyone noticed, it looked as if it had always been that way. Evelyn had watched her do this to other women. She had told herself, for 5 years, that her position inside the marriage protected her, that Julian would not allow it. She had been wrong about Julian. She had not been wrong about her position. Her position had simply been different than she understood it. She opened her laptop. There was work to do. At the Alderton Club that evening, the engagement dinner moved exactly as Margaret had planned it, which meant exactly according to Margaret's preferences, and everyone else adjusted in real time. Annabelle Price was 29 years old and had the poise of someone raised in a family where poise was a professional skill passed down like silverware. She was striking, precise, and smiled at the right moments with an efficiency that Margaret found genuinely admirable. She was also, as Julian was discovering over the course of the dinner, nearly impossible to have a real conversation with. Not because she was unintelligent. She was clearly intelligent, but intelligence deployed entirely in service of opacity produces its own kind of loneliness in the people around it, and by the time the main course arrived, Julian understood that every personal question he asked was answered with something true and entirely unrevealing. He knew her charitable interests, her travel preferences, her opinion on the new development on Park. He did not know a single thing she actually cared about. He poured himself more water. His mother was 3 seats down, deep in conversation with Stanford Price, wearing the focused warmth she reserved for people she needed something from. Being her son had meant learning to function in the margins of that light, visible and useful, never quite its source. He looked at Annabelle. She looked back with a smile that was polite and accurate and told him nothing. He thought about Evelyn, which he had been telling himself he was not going to do. He thought about the way she used to move through dinners like this, finding the one person at the table who was not performing and spending the evening in a real conversation with them while somehow managing every social obligation at the same time. He had never properly appreciated it because he had never properly noticed it. He excused himself and went out to the terrace. The night air was cold. He stood at the railing and looked at the city and thought about nothing specific, which was a way of thinking about something very specific. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. CFO wants to flag something on the Whitlock file before the week's end. Says the language in the notice is boilerplate, but the timing is unusual. Can you fit 15 minutes tomorrow? Julian typed back morning and put the phone away. He went back inside. He sat through the rest of the dinner and said the right things and shook the right hands. On the drive home, he sat in the back of the car and looked at his phone without turning it on, and he felt the evening settling into him the way evenings do when something has not been right, and you cannot quite name what. His mother called from her own car. The dinner went well. Dinner again with her family on Saturday. Let the alliance breathe. Fine. And Julian, do not contact Evelyn. There is nothing useful that can come from it. He said he understood. She was already moving to the next thing, as she always was. He went home. He stood at his window for a while. Then he went to the file his assistant had sent over earlier in the week and pulled up the original Whitlock Credit Partners facility documents. He started reading. The relationship went back 14 years. His father had initiated it, which Julian had not known. He found the original correspondence between his father and Whitlock in the secondary file, and he read through it with the slow attention of someone encountering a room in a house they thought they knew completely. On page 11, he found the cross-reference, an affiliated entity covenant that extended Whitlock's review rights across any institution in which they held a controlling interest. He read it twice and understood that whoever represented Whitlock had a structural position that ran through everything the Reeve Group touched. He kept reading. Near the back of the correspondence file, tucked between two formal letters, was a single page of his father's handwriting. He had seen enough of his father's handwriting over the years to recognize it immediately. The forward and the compressed letters of a man who always wrote as if the page was about to run out. It was a note to himself, undated, on Reeve Group stationery. He read it. The note said, "The Whitlock woman is sharp, sharper than the men who came with her. Do not let the relationship become routine. Do not take it for granted. Whatever else happens, keep this relationship." Julian sat with that for a long time. His father had been dead for 7 years. He had spent those 7 years building the company on a foundation his father laid, and he had known the broad shape of that foundation without having read every document underneath it. There were things in this file he had never looked at. There were, it turned out, things his father had understood that he had never passed along, the Whitlock woman. He looked at the date on the letter below it. 11 years ago, the renewal of the facility, a year before his father died. He closed the documents and sat at his kitchen table and looked at the wall. The Whitlock woman was sharp. His father had been impressed by whoever sat across from him and negotiated that renewal. The E. Whitlock, named as the authorized signatory on the document, was in her early 20s at the time. He had passed over that detail when he first read it, because a 22-year-old as the principal representative of a major credit institution seemed unlikely. He pulled the document back up and looked at the signature again. E. Whitlock. The ink was confident and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who did not use a signature as a formality but as a statement. He knew someone else who signed things that way. He sat with that fact for a long time in the quiet of his kitchen, not following the thought all the way to where it was going, because following it all the way was going to require him to confront several other things at the same time. But the question did not go away. It stayed with him all night, not loud, just present, the way a real question sits with you when you do not yet have the courage to ask it directly. Chapter 3. What she warned him about comes true. The clause was in Section 14. It was not hidden in the way a lawyer hides things they want you to miss. It was written in plain contractual English, 4 paragraphs into a section called Alliance Conditions and Consideration, which sounded administrative enough that most people would read it with one part of their attention somewhere else. Julian found out on Monday morning when Patricia, his general counsel, walked into his office without knocking, which she had never done in 7 years of working together. She put a document on his desk and stood back with the expression of someone who has delivered hard news before and has learned to say nothing further until the other person has finished reading. Julian read it. Then he read it again. He set it down. When did we receive this? This morning. Price Capital's legal team sent it at 7:15. Patricia folded her hands. It is a formal activation notice. The clause triggered the moment the engagement went public Thursday night. What does it require? A transfer of 15% of controlling shares in the Reeve Group to a jointly administered trust. 2 Price family representatives on the trust. She paused. The transfer is irreversible, Julian, and it executed the moment Stanford Price sent the announcement. He looked at the document. Our team reviewed the original agreement at signing, she said. This section was flagged as standard deal structure for a strategic alliance. I know, Julian. Her voice took on the careful precision of a woman who needs the record to reflect that she said this plainly. This is not standard deal structure. This is a control transfer mechanism. Someone at Price Capital knew exactly what they were doing when they drafted it. He nodded. She left the document and closed the door. He sat for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer. There was a folder inside that had been sitting there for 6 weeks. He had put it there the day after Evelyn walked out of the library because he had not known what to do with it and was not ready to throw it away. Evelyn had given it to him 2 months before the divorce. On a Sunday evening, when she sat across from him at the kitchen table and said she needed him to read something before they discussed what his mother was proposing, he had taken it and said he would look at it, and then he had not because his mother called that night, and the week had started the way weeks do when you are running a company and a family at the same time, and the folder had traveled from the counter to the desk to the drawer and stayed there. He opened it now. 12 pages, dense, precise, written in the clean and economical style of someone who trusts numbers and does not waste words around them. Evelyn had identified the clause in Section 14. She had traced its mechanism through 3 pages of cross-references and explained, in a single annotated paragraph, exactly what it would do the moment an engagement was publicly announced. She had calculated the share transfer value. She had found 2 comparable deal structures from the previous decade and shown how both ended with the founding family losing operational control within 4 years. She had gotten every number right. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting as clean as the rest of the document, she had written a single line, "Please read this before Friday." He had not read it before Friday. He had not read it at all. He closed the folder and sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall. He thought about his mother telling him Evelyn was trying to create problems because she felt threatened. He thought about the fact that a financial analysis is not a document about feelings. He had known those were 2 different kinds of documents. He had chosen to let them be the same thing because it was easier. He picked up the phone and called David Chen. I need you to look at something today. Today, David. Send it over. I will clear my afternoon. Julian photographed every page of the price document and the activation letter and sent them both. Then he looked out the window at a city, doing what it always did. David called back 3 hours later. It is valid, he said, and it is bad. You signed the agreement and your team reviewed it. Contesting this is 18 months of litigation at minimum with unfavorable odds. He paused. You have two options, comply and manage within a structure that now has price representatives on your controlling trust, or dissolve the alliance before the share transfer executes. The clause gives you a 48-hour window from the activation notice. That window closes Wednesday morning. Dissolving the alliance means ending the engagement. Yes. Julian said nothing. Julian, how did this clause get past your review? He looked at the drawer. It did not, he said. Someone reviewed it and decided it was acceptable. A silence on the line that said David understood what that meant without Julian having to say it further. Memo by tonight, David said. No public statements until we have talked through the options. Julian hung up and opened the drawer again. He put the folder on top of the desk where he could see it and went to his next meeting. The article went up on a financial blog at 11:30 on a Tuesday morning, time to land in the midday traffic before the afternoon news cycle absorbed it. The headline was vague, and the language was careful, and every sentence was structured to do damage without being provable. Sources close to the Reeve divorce. Questions about motives and timeline. A woman who had, according to unnamed family friends of the Reeve household, shown behavior during the marriage that raised questions not yet fully addressed. The words paternity and affair did not appear. They did not need to. The implication was the entire point. Evelyn read it at her kitchen table at noon. She read it once straight through, then read the first 2 paragraphs again. Then she closed the laptop. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the apartment. Outside the window, the city ran on as it always did, indifferent to what was happening at this table, which was that a woman who had built a careful and independent life and entered a marriage in good faith was sitting with the feeling of having her character described by people who had never tried to know her for an audience with no reason to doubt them. She was not angry. Anger was too clean for this. What she felt was older and heavier, exhaustion and grief mixed together with the cold recognition of having known somewhere underneath everything that Margaret was capable of exactly this. She had just underestimated how it would feel to see it printed. She pushed back from the table. She walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. She put her feet flat on the floor and her hands on her knees and looked at the wall in front of her. She stayed that way for a while. Then she put her hand on her stomach. The baby shifted, that small interior movement she had come to find steadying even in difficult moments. They are going to keep going, she said, not quite to anyone. They are going to keep going until they decide there is nothing left to take. And we are not going to let that happen. She sat with that for another minute. Then she picked up her phone and called Cassius. He answered on the second ring. I read it, he said before she could speak. Then you know, yes. The compression in his voice was the anger he had decided not to lead with. If I take the position now, she said, on my terms, with the governance conditions we discussed, can you hold the board? Yes. And the price capital facility? 72 hours from your formal authorization, then get Graham ready. She paused. 3 days, and quiet until Thursday. Quiet, he said. Then after a moment, Evelyn, I am sorry it got this far. She looked at the wall. Me too. Talk tomorrow. She ended the call. She went to the desk in the corner of the room and took out the authorization documents Graham had prepared, the ones she had been carrying around for 9 days. She signed them. both pages in 3 places each, with the signature she had not used in 8 years. Evelyn Whitlock, not a weapon, not a performance, her name. The one she had spent 8 years pretending did not belong to her, which had been, in the end, the most expensive fiction she ever maintained. She put them in the envelope Graham had addressed and sealed it. In the 2 weeks that followed, on the surface nothing changed. Evelyn went to her appointments. She had groceries delivered. She took 2 calls with Graham, and 1 with a financial forensics consultant who confirmed. After reviewing the price capital structure, that the facility Whitlock held was exactly what she believed it to be. She walked in the park on mornings that were not too cold. She started putting the baby's room together, which she had finally started calling the baby's room. She bought a lamp and a small bookshelf and spent an afternoon arranging it with the books she wanted him to grow up knowing existed. Below the surface, things were moving. Whitlock Credit Partners sent 3 communications to 3 different institutions over 10 days. Nothing was loud, nothing was obvious. But in the world where capital moves and the movement sends signals, the signals were clear to anyone who knew how to read them. Price Capital began to receive questions from 2 equity partners it had not been expecting. Both conversations ended without incident but without resolution. That was its own kind of signal. On the last Thursday of November, Julian's assistant placed an envelope on his desk. Heavy card stock, formal, communicating seriousness through the quality of the paper before you read a word. The header read Whitlock Credit Partners. The body requested the presence of all relevant principals at a creditor summit, including the CEO of the Reeve Group, the relevant representatives of Price Capital, and their respective counsel. The Whitlock representative would be introduced at the opening of the meeting. Julian read it twice. He took it to his mother that evening. She read it, handed it back, and told him to send Gerald. This is a routine creditor review. It does not require you personally. The letter requests me specifically. Everyone requests the CEO specifically. It is a politeness. Send Gerald. She was already reaching for her phone. What I need from you this week is to firm up Saturday's dinner with the Prices and review the December press materials. The alliance needs momentum. He looked at the invitation. He thought about his father's handwriting on a single piece of stationery. The Whitlock woman is sharp. Whatever else happens, keep this relationship. He thought about E. Whitlock and the confident signature on a renewal document signed a year before his father died. He thought about the folder in his desk drawer. He did not send Gerald. He called Graham Ellery the following morning and confirmed his personal attendance. Graham thanked him in the even, patient tone of a man for whom this had been expected all along. Julian put the phone down and sat quietly at his desk. He had spent 30 days not quite looking directly at something. He understood, sitting there, that he was about to find out what it was. He had known that for a while. He was done choosing not to know it. Chapter 4. The name on the other side of the table. The creditor summit was scheduled for 10 o'clock. By 9:45, the conference room on the 44th floor was almost full. It was a long room with east-facing windows that looked out over Midtown and a table that seated 16. Over the years, this room had held enough decisions of real consequence that the people on this floor had an informal distinction between meetings held here and meetings held elsewhere. The ones held here were the ones that mattered. Julian sat at the near head of the table. His CFO Gerald was to his left. Patricia was to his right. 2 bankers from the Reeve Group's primary credit relationship were farther down. Stanford Price arrived at 9:30 with 4 people. Annabelle had come with him, which Julian had not expected. She sat 2 seats from her father, composed in the way she always was, with the stillness of someone who has been thoroughly briefed and has decided not to reveal how thoroughly. Stanford himself was 61, broad-shouldered, a man for whom certainty had become, over decades of being right in rooms, indistinguishable from his character. He settled into his chair with the authority of someone who expects the day to go the way he planned it. Margaret was in a chair against the wall behind Julian's right shoulder, close enough to see everything, far enough to maintain the appearance of not running anything. At the far head of the table, directly opposite Julian, a chair sat empty. Beside that chair stood Morris, Whitlock Credit Partners' legal representative, somewhere in his mid-50s, in a gray suit that was expensive without advertising the fact. He had the quality of someone who is rarely the loudest person in a room, but is frequently the one everyone defers to before they understand why. Stanford Price suggested at 9:50 that they begin without waiting. Morris said quietly and without looking at his watch, "We will wait." Stanford smiled pleasantly and said nothing further. He had misread the room. Julian looked at the empty chair. He had spent significant time in the past 2 weeks reading documents rather than summaries. The Whitlock Facility Agreement in full, all 47 pages. The historic correspondence between Whitlock and the Reeve Group going back 14 years. He had read all of it himself, at his kitchen table, at night, with the attention of a man who has recently understood that reading something himself and having someone else read it are not equivalent activities. Whitlock Credit Partners held the primary credit facility for the Reeve Group, not one of several, the primary one. The relationship went back to his father's time. In the Third Amendment, dated 11 years ago, he had found an affiliated entity covenant stating that any institution in which Whitlock held a controlling financial interest was subject to the same review and recourse provisions as the Reeve Group itself. Whoever sat in that empty chair had a structural position that ran through everything the Reeve Group touched. The elevator at the far end of the hallway opened at 3 minutes past 10. Morris straightened. He picked up his folder and opened it. 2 people came through the conference room door first. Julian recognized Graham Ellery from their brief phone conversation, a man in his 60s moving with the unhurried precision of someone used to rooms with significant money in them. Graham went to the chair beside Morris and set his briefcase down. Then she came through the door. Julian saw the dress first, navy structured at the shoulder, simple enough to be invisible until the person wearing it made it otherwise. Then she was in the room, crossing it with the direct and unhurried walk of someone who knows exactly where she is going, and he had 1 full second of watching her before understanding what he was seeing. Evelyn. She walked to the empty chair at the far head of the table and sat down. She set a leather folder in front of her, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at the room the way the room had not yet looked at her, which was calmly and completely. "Evelyn Whitlock," Morris said, reading the name the way you read something you have read many times. Sole heir and authorized controlling representative of Whitlock Credit Partners. The room went still. Julian heard the words and felt something shift in his chest that was not a physical sensation, so much as the experience of several things he had believed to be separate becoming, without warning, fully connected. He watched his own understanding rearrange itself in real time, the way you watch something you took to be a wall reveal itself as a door that has been there the whole time. Evelyn Whitlock, not Cross, not Reeve. Whitlock, WCP. The initials on the watch face he had seen every day for 5 years and asked about once and never thought about again. The name on the facility documents he had spent 2 weeks reading. The name on 3 notices in 30 days. The name of the authorized signatory on a renewal document signed 11 years ago, in a confident and unhurried hand by someone his father had described as the sharpest person in the room. the name of the institution that held the primary credit facility his father had built the Reeve Group on. He had been married to her for 5 years. He had watched her read documents. He had watched her read the divorce papers he handed her without once thinking about what else she knew how to read. He had put her financial analysis in a drawer. Across the table, Stanford Price's composure had shifted, not collapsed. Stanford was too experienced for that, but the set of his shoulders had changed in the way of a man who walked into a room with a complete picture of how the day would go and has just been shown the picture is wrong. Margaret, behind Julian's right shoulder, had gone completely still. Annabelle was looking at Evelyn with the most honest expression Julian had seen from her in 6 weeks. The focused look of someone doing a rapid and serious recalculation. Evelyn opened her folder. She looked at Stanford first. "Thank you for making the time," she said, in the same even and unhurried voice she had used in the library on the morning she signed the divorce papers. "I will be brief. Whitlock Credit Partners has completed its periodic review of the Price Capital facility. After full assessment of current exposure and forward risk considerations, we have made the decision to withdraw from that position, effective today." She placed a document on the table and slid it toward Graham, who picked it up and held it for Stanford's lawyer to take. Stanford's lawyer took it. He read the first page. He turned to the second. He turned back to the first. Annabelle watched her father. Stanford was looking at Evelyn with an expression that had moved past recalculation into something quieter and more final. He was a man who had spent his career understanding leverage, and he understood what he was looking at. The withdrawal notice has a 14-day execution window. Evelyn continued. "Your team will want to begin conversations with your equity partners promptly. I would expect those conversations to raise questions about the facility structure, which is reasonable given the circumstances. My team is available to your legal representatives throughout the process. We want this to go smoothly," Stanford said. "You understand what this does?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "The alliance, I understand." Stanford looked at her for a long moment. His lawyer leaned in and said something low. Stanford listened without looking away from Evelyn. Then he sat back. The Price Capital side of the table had the quality of a position that has just understood its own exposure. The calculation had shifted, and everyone on that side was now doing the same arithmetic and arriving at the same number, which was not the number they had walked in expecting. Stanford looked at Julian. Julian held the look and said nothing. "We will need some time," Stanford said. The language of a man who knows a door has closed and is deciding how to walk away with something intact. Morris moved them through the remaining formal items with brisk efficiency. Documents exchanged. Acknowledgments signed. By 11:15, the Price contingent had gathered their materials and departed with the controlled pace of people who have somewhere important to be and prefer not to be watched on their way there. The room rearranged itself in their absence. Julian looked down the length of the table at Evelyn. She was reviewing something with Graham, head bent slightly, pen moving at the margin of a page. The watch on her wrist caught the light from the east windows. He had looked at that watch 10,000 times. Margaret came to stand beside him. He had not heard her cross the room. "This is manageable," she said, in the low register she used when thinking through something rather than presenting it. "The Price Alliance can be restructured. There are other options, other families." Julian did not answer. "Julian, I heard you. Then let us step out and discuss this properly." He did not move. At the far end of the table, Evelyn closed her folder and stood. She looked at Julian directly for the first time since walking in. It was not a long look. It was the look of two people with a great deal of history between them, most of it unresolved, standing in a room where pretending otherwise had become impossible. Then she walked toward the door. He followed, not because he had decided to, because he moved toward the real thing in the room, which is what you do when you have spent too long moving away from it. She was waiting at the elevator. She heard him come into the hallway and did not turn around. Evelyn. She turned. She looked the way she had in the library on the morning of the divorce. The way a person looks when they have been through every version of a conversation and arrived at the far end of it and are simply waiting for the other person to catch up. I read your analysis, he said, the one you gave me in September. I know. I put it in a drawer. I know that too. He was quiet. He had an entire architecture of things he might say, and none of them were equal to what had just happened in that room. Not the Whitlock revelation specifically, the whole shape of it, the 5 years of it. Why did you not tell me? He said. She considered that honestly, because I needed to know if it mattered, who I was without the name. I needed someone to look at Evelyn and want her, not the institution behind her. By the time I understood the test was unfair to both of us, it was too late to redesign it. The elevator arrived. She did not step in yet. I am not telling you this to excuse anything, she said. I kept something from you that you had the right to know. That is true, but what you chose to do in September, Julian, that was not about not knowing. You had the analysis. You had what you needed to see. You chose not to look. He did not argue. She stepped toward the elevator. Evelyn, she looked back. He did not have the right sentence yet. He had the shape of something, but not the words, and he was not someone who had earned the right to say it in any case. So instead, he said the thing that was true and small and available to him right now. He has my jaw. She stopped. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but the place where smiles begin. He does, she said. We will see what else he gets. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in and turned to face forward. In the last second before the doors closed, her expression had shifted from the composed and finished quality of the conference room into something that was briefly and entirely just a person, a woman who was 7 months pregnant and had just done something enormous and was going to go home and figure out what to have for lunch. He stood in the hallway until the elevator indicator showed her moving down through the floors. His mother's heels on the marble behind him. She came to stand beside him, and he turned and saw on her face the expression she wore when a situation had moved past her parameters, and she was already calculating how to come back in. She is not going to walk away from this cleanly, Margaret said. Her voice was low and precise. A woman who hid her identity throughout an entire marriage, who deliberately concealed her financial interests from her husband, who is now using those interests to interfere with a legitimate business arrangement. That is a pattern of behavior, Julian. A judge reviewing a custody arrangement would want to know about it. He looked at her. I spoke to a family attorney this morning, she continued. Grandparental rights are an established legal framework in this state. It would not require me to be the primary applicant. It would simply require me to establish consistent interest in the welfare of my grandchild and raise appropriate questions about the stability of the primary custodial environment. She paused. I am not making a threat. I am telling you that options exist. Julian looked at his mother. He had been looking at her his entire life the way you look at weather, something to understand and navigate and work within. He had never once stood in front of her and looked at her the way he was looking now, which is the way you look at something you are seeing clearly for the first time after a very long time of choosing not to. She was describing a custody action against a 7 months pregnant woman as a pressure tactic, not to protect his child, to protect her position. No, he said. She looked at him. No, he said again. Not loud, the opposite of loud. the sound of something closing that had been open his entire life. She started to speak. "I need you to leave this building today," he said. "And I need you to call off whatever you have set in motion with the family attorney." Margaret was very still. "If you do not, the next conversation you have with me will be through David Chen's office." He walked back into the conference room where Patricia and Gerald were waiting, and he told them to clear the afternoon. Behind him in the hallway, his mother stood very still and very quiet. He did not look back. He had been looking back his entire life. He was done with that now. Chapter 5. What the Silence Bought. The morning Evelyn drove to the Reeve estate, she did not rush. She called ahead, not out of courtesy, but because she wanted to arrive at a door that had been deliberately opened for her, and she wanted Margaret to have had the full morning to compose herself. The composed version of Margaret was the version that would try everything she had left. Evelyn needed to see all of it, clearly and completely, before the thing between them could be finished, the housekeeper answered. Evelyn said she would arrive at 10. Margaret came on the line a moment later, pleasant and controlled, with the confidence of a woman who had already decided how the conversation would go and was simply waiting for it to start. 10 is fine, she said. Evelyn set the phone down and finished her breakfast. She wore a gray dress. Simple, long, with a cut that made room for her 8 months without making her feel arranged around the pregnancy rather than simply herself. She took a car across town through the thin November light and watched the city move past the windows and thought about what she wanted the next 2 hours to feel like when she looked back on them later. She wanted them to feel clean. The housekeeper held the door. Evelyn walked through it with the full awareness of a person crossing a threshold for the last time. She was not sentimental about it. She just noticed it, the way you notice a last time when you are present enough to recognize one. She crossed the marble hall. She pushed open the library door. Margaret was standing at the window. It was the position Julian had occupied on the morning of the divorce, and Evelyn registered the symmetry without dwelling on it. Margaret turned when she came in deliberately, with the timing of someone who has been waiting and wants that to be understood. She wore charcoal, pearl earrings, silver hair, everything in its place as it always was. Evelyn. She did not move from the window. "I expected you might come. I know you did." Evelyn set her bag on the chair nearest the door and remained standing. "I am going to ask you to do one thing today. After that, it is done. What happens next between you and Julian is between the two of you. I have no interest in that part." Margaret's expression was attentive and completely closed. "And if I decline, then we will be in a courtroom inside 30 days, and the proceeding will not be about custody." Evelyn reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table between them. "Read the first 2 pages before we go any further." Margaret crossed the room and sat down. She opened the folder. The first thing inside was a printout of the article, the one from 3 weeks ago, with the careful language and the insinuation built into every sentence like a structural element. Evelyn had bracketed 2 paragraphs in the margin, no annotation, just the indication of where to look. Margaret read the marked paragraphs without any change in expression. She turned to the next page. On the next page was a transcript, 6 pages, formatted with timestamps and speaker identifications. The speakers were identified as Margaret Hargrove Reeve and the managing editor of a digital financial publication. The date was 3 weeks ago. The transcript had been produced and certified by a firm that handled exactly this kind of documentation, and their certification stamp was at the bottom of the first page. Margaret read the first paragraph. Her hands, which had been resting flat on the open folder, curled inward at the fingers. Just slightly. A small, involuntary contraction that she controlled almost immediately, pressing both palms back down against the page, but she had not controlled it quickly enough, and Evelyn had seen it, and they both knew she had seen it. Margaret kept reading. The transcript captured the language she had used when describing the strategy for the article, including the phrase "create reasonable public doubt about paternity without making a direct claim," and the phrase "the pregnancy is actually useful to us here if we frame it correctly," and the phrase "she is not going to have the resources to fight this and us at the same time." It captured the managing editor's cooperative responses. It captured the moment near the end of the call when Margaret said, with a satisfaction that came through clearly even in transcript form, "By the time anyone can trace it back, the narrative will already be established." The last page was a letter from Evelyn's attorney. The first paragraph described the legal exposure. The second said that none of these causes of action would be filed, provided Margaret Reeve signed the attached document. The attached document was a 2-page release written in plain and unambiguous language. Margaret Reeve waived permanently and irrevocably any legal claim or action related to custody of, access to, or guardianship of the child currently carried by Evelyn Whitlock. She would not initiate, fund, support, or participate in any such action in any jurisdiction at any future time. At the bottom, a line for her signature. Margaret closed the folder. She set both hands flat on the table in front of her and looked at the middle distance. At a point somewhere between the folder and the window, she was very still. Evelyn waited. She had learned to wait from years of watching Margaret herself do it. Silence is not empty. It is full of information, and the person who can sit inside it without rushing to fill it is always, eventually, the one who reads it better. "The recording is inadmissible," Margaret said. "In a criminal proceeding, possibly. In a civil proceeding in front of a jury, it is a phone call in which you describe planting a story to destabilize a pregnant woman's custody position." Evelyn let a beat settle. "I have had 2 attorneys look at this in the past 10 days. Neither of them used the word inadmissible." Margaret looked at the folder. "Whatever you have built here," she said, "it has a window. And when it closes, Evelyn said, "I will handle it the same way I handled this, with preparation." Margaret looked at her then, a long look, the kind that contains years rather than seconds. And something happened behind her eyes that Evelyn had never once seen there in 5 years of marriage. It did not arrive with drama. It was not a collapse. It was something that came through in the space between one breath and the next, a crack in the surface of 40 years of composure, just wide enough to see through. It was the look of a woman who had won every room she had ever walked into, and who was sitting in the room where that had finally, completely stopped being true. She looked away. In 40 years of negotiations, in every boardroom and courtroom and drawing room she had ever entered, Margaret Reeve had never looked away first. Evelyn had watched her hold the gaze of men twice her size, of lawyers with decades on her, of competitors who thought her age was a weakness. She had never once been the one to look away. She looked away now. Then her composure came back, the way a shutter closes, smooth and trained and absolute. She reached for the pen. She signed the document. She set the pen down against the mahogany with a small, deliberate click and pushed the folder back toward Evelyn without looking at her again. Evelyn picked it up. She put it in her bag. She stood. "Thank you," she said, and she walked out. She crossed the hall for the last time. She stepped outside into the November morning. The cold air hit her, and she stopped on the front step for a moment and breathed it in. Then she went to the car. Her phone rang before they cleared the neighborhood. "Graham, your grandfather would like a word this afternoon," he said. "What is it?" A pause that told her what she needed to know. "The board," he said. Cassius was sitting when she arrived, tea on the table beside him, untouched. He had been thinking about this for several hours. The board met yesterday afternoon without me, he said. They want the child named as the fourth-generation principal heir to the Whitlock Trust at birth. Formal designation in the primary governance documents. The name Whitlock in the legal record from the beginning. He looked at her. I could not stop the meeting from happening. I want you to know that. She had lived inside that logic her whole life. She had walked out of it at 22. She was not going to let her son be placed back inside it before he could breathe on his own. No, she said. Cassius looked at her and did not speak. He will know this institution and this family. I will raise him to understand it and take it seriously. But he will receive that from me in the way I decide when I believe he is ready. She held her grandfather's gaze. He will not be designated anything before he is old enough to understand what the designation means. That is the condition. The board will push back, Cassius said. You have mechanisms that can hold them. You know you do, and if you use them to give me this, I will be at this table every day for the next 20 years doing the work you have always wanted me to do. That is a better return than a 4-day-old baby's name on a document. Something moved across her grandfather's face that sat between a smile and resignation, the expression of a man who has played chess for 50 years and has just watched someone take a piece he did not know they had seen. I will speak to the board in the morning, he said. She stood and kissed him once on the cheek, which she had not done since she was a girl. He reached up and pressed her hand briefly, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing left that needed saying. She took the elevator down. She was 8 months pregnant and had confronted her mother-in-law and argued with her grandfather's board, and it was barely 3 in the afternoon. She bought a sandwich from the deli on the corner and ate it in the car on the way home and tasted almost none of it. She was on the couch with her feet up and her eyes half closed when the buzzer sounded. She looked at the intercom screen. She recognized the face. She told the doorman to send him up. She was standing in the kitchen when Julian knocked, and she opened the door and looked at him in the hallway. He looked like a man who had not slept well in a while and had stopped trying to hide it. He was in a dark coat she did not recognize, which meant he had bought it after she left. Come in, she said. He came in and looked at the apartment the way you look at a place you are seeing for the first time, but have somehow imagined. He took in the boxes mostly unpacked now, the lamp she had bought, the bookshelf in the hall waiting to be hung. He did not say anything about any of it. Sit down, she said. You look like you have been standing all day. He sat in the chair across from the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, in the posture of someone who is not planning to stay long enough to get comfortable. I am not here to ask for anything, he said. I want you to know that before anything else. All right, I am not going to make a case for myself or ask you to reconsider anything. I know what I did, and I know what I did not do. I have spent enough time with both of those things this month to understand the difference between them. He looked at his hands. What I need to say is that I read your analysis, all of it, and I understand what I was looking at and why I did not look at it when you asked me to. She waited. My mother told me you were trying to create problems because you felt threatened by the price arrangement. And some part of me knew that a financial analysis is not a document about feelings. Those are two different kinds of documents. He stopped. I chose to let them be the same thing because it was easier. That is the honest version of it. The apartment was quiet around them. The city outside always moving, always indifferent. I know, she said. I am sorry. She looked at him. The apology was real. She knew the difference. After 5 years, between Julian performing something and Julian meaning it. This was the second kind. She accepted it for what it was, which was not a solution and not a restoration, but a true thing honestly offered, and that was not nothing. "I owe you the same," she said. "I kept something from you that you had the right to know. I told myself I was testing whether what we had was real, but a test you design and administer without telling the other person is not a test. It is a trap. You were in it for 5 years without knowing the rules." She paused. "That was not fair. So we were both wrong?" he said. "Yes, and we cannot fix that." "No." He sat with that. Then he looked up, and his face had the expression she had seen in a conference room years ago when he had argued her position and then turned around and apologized for it with a self-awareness that had genuinely surprised her. Not performing, not calculating, just looking at her, and she felt the difference between being seen and being assessed. And she understood how long it had been since he had looked at her the first way. "I want to meet him," he said. "I want to show up, not the way my father showed up, something different from that." He paused. "I know I have to earn that. I know you are the one who decides. I am not asking for an answer tonight." She looked at him for a long time. She had planned the conflict so carefully, thought through every outcome, built every protection. What she had not spent much time on was this. What came after, what it looked like when the fight was over, and there were 2 people and a child and a set of choices still ahead of them. She was not ready to make promises. Promises were not the honest currency right now. But she said, "I will think about it." He nodded. He understood what it was and what it was not, and he did not push past it. He stood to leave. She walked him to the door. When she reached past him to open it, her hand and his landed on the door frame at the same moment, her fingers just below his. Neither of them moved for a beat, just one beat, long enough for both of them to feel the weight of 5 years and everything that had happened inside them. Then she stepped back, and he did too, and she opened the door, and the ordinary sounds of the building hallway came in around them. He looked at her. Then his eyes went to her wrist, to the watch. He stood there for a moment, just looking at it, and she watched something move through his face that was not calculation, but something older and simpler, the genuine arrival of understanding, the kind that comes when you finally see what has been in front of you all along. He looked up. "All those years," he said, "I never asked, what did WCP stand for?" She looked down at the watch, then at him. "Whitlock Credit Partners," she said. "My grandfather had it made when I was 12. He said I was going to run it one day and I should wear the reminder. Did you believe him?" She held his gaze. "No, I wore it because I was angry at him, and it was the one thing I refused to give back." Julian looked at the watch one more time. "He was not wrong," he said. It was a simple thing to say, but it was true in a way that ran through the full length of everything they had been to each other, all 5 years of it, and standing in the doorway, they both felt that, and neither of them added anything to it, because nothing needed adding. He left. She heard the elevator. She stood in the open doorway for a moment. After the sound of it faded, her hand still on the frame where his had been. Then she closed the door. She put her hand on her stomach and stayed there in the quiet of her own apartment, not doing anything, not planning anything, just letting the day settle into what it was. 2 weeks later, on a Friday afternoon, she was putting the baby's room together. She had painted it a color between green and gray that changed depending on the light, darker in the morning and softer as the afternoon came through. The crib was assembled. The bookshelf was full. She had spent an evening arranging it with books in an order that meant something to her, the ones she wanted him to find first near the top and the ones she wanted him to work toward lower down. She was standing in the middle of the room when the west light came through the window at the angle that only holds for about 20 minutes at this time of year, and the room looked exactly like what she had meant for it to look like. She caught her reflection in the window glass. The watch was on her wrist. She stood there for a moment, looking at it. 20 years. She had worn it as a protest, and then as a habit, and then as something that had stopped having a simple meaning. It was her grandfather's, and it was her history, and it was the institution she had spent 8 years running from, and had now, on her own terms, walked back into. She did not need to wear it anymore to know what it meant. She took it off. The absence of it felt strange. A lightness that was disorienting, the way your hands feel when you put down something heavy, and your arms do not yet know what to do without the weight. She walked to the bookshelf and set it next to the lamp, beside a small wooden frame that did not have a photograph in it yet, but would. Then she reached for her phone. She opened the camera. She stood in the middle of the room and took a photograph of it, not because anyone had asked her to, not for any record that needed keeping, just because this was the first room she had built entirely for someone else, painted the colors she chose, furnished the way she decided, arranged with the books she wanted him to know. She looked at the photograph on the screen for a moment. It was a good room. It was exactly what she had meant it to be. She put the phone down and picked up the empty frame and looked at it. One day, there would be a face in it. She was going to put this photograph there first, a room before the person who would grow up in it. A beginning before the beginning. She stepped back and looked at the room as a whole, a room that was ready. She put both hands on the window frame and looked out at the city. All that movement, all those lives going in every direction at once, the whole machinery of it running on as it always had, indifferent and continuous, entirely unaware that a woman was standing in a window on the Upper West Side who had just finished something large and was beginning something else. Her son was going to be born into this world. He was going to learn, in the way children learn things not through being told but through the texture of the life around them, that the woman who raised him had chosen her battles carefully and had not lost the ones that mattered. He was going to learn, someday, that his father had made a wrong choice and had chosen differently afterward, and that the measure of a person is not the worst thing they did, but what they did when they understood it. She was not ready to decide what came next between the two of them. She was going to let it show itself in time. Real things did that. They showed you what they were. The sun was almost gone. The room was soft in what remained of the light. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved. She smiled. Not the smile of someone who has won something. The smile of a person who is, for the first time in a very long time, not preparing for the next fight, just standing in a room she chose, in a life she built, with everything she needed and nothing she did not. She had never been less afraid in her life.